With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
I've been paid to write about baseball and talk about baseball almost continuously since the late 1990s. I've been very fortunate that way. The time that I've taken away from it has largely been my choice. Sometimes it's been very lucrative and other times more like a kind of side job, but that doesn't matter so much. What matters is that I've gotten to do this. I've gotten to devote my life to talking about a kid's game that, for reasons I don't wholly understand, captured my imagination when I was quite young compared to what I am now, the age I am now. And more importantly, I hope that I've gotten to show that although it is a game that kids can play and that even the adults who play it do so in a kind of set of pajamas with pretensions of being a uniform, that even though it is in that sense only a game, it's the American game. And whether men or boys or even women and girls are playing it, and this would extend to softball too, if I knew more about it and the stories that it produced, but within that environment, we can find ourselves. Like a lot of you, I went through the American public school system. Supposedly, I got a better deal out of it than most. At least that's what my school system kept telling me over and over again as I went stumbling down the hallway reluctantly to my next class. And I remember what it was like to take history. And obviously, if you've listened to the show at all, you know how much I love that subject. And yet it was a drag. Part of the problem is that American history, the teaching of it, is so politicized that very few teachers can figure out how to teach it well or accurately or engagingly. I don't want to take away from your 7th grade history teacher, Mr. Gumpert. I'm sure he did a fantastic job. There are always exceptions if you are in the right place at the right time. And so it becomes like taking medicine if you're a kid. But what I found is that if you can fold Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio, not just Yankees, of course, Stan Musial, Sandy Koufax, Harley Latham, Bad Bill Dallin, I could just keep going, show how these ball players were along for the ride on the ship of American history, and sometimes they caused it or were affected by it or were shot at or beaten because of it. And suddenly the medicinal quality goes away. That's what I've tried to do here for 8 years. Now, in an earlier part of my career, I used to get out more. I want to be very clear about this, though. I've rarely been a reporter, much less so since I lost part of my vision and then started fainting in public places. It's been a wild medical ride, folks, but for a good number of years, whether through working with the Yes Network or MLB.com or Baseball Prospectus for that matter, I got to talk to players and general managers and managers. I had a fraction of the number of opportunities to do this that the daily beat writers do. I do not want to steal valor from the beat writers. I say that every time I bring up my ballpark reporting experience. I absolutely am not trying to claim that I did what they do every day. I had the privilege to show up when I felt like I needed to or wanted to. And they have done so much more of that than I have, and they put time. And this is one of the ways that, whereas I don't think I would ever want to be a beat writer for a lot of reasons, I was jealous of them in the sense that since they were there every day, they were able to put energy into developing relationships with the players that I could not. So have we got that part squared away? Good. Now, having said that, I don't think you need to talk to people in baseball every day to learn very quickly that the privilege of fandom, not to mention sports talk radio hosts, to pretend that these people, the people who run your favorite ball club, are stupid. They're not. They can see the obvious. Now, I want to caveat that in a way that I would were we talking about any profession, from artisan carpentry to public accounting. There's a range of execution by every person in every job. including mine. Some are better at their jobs than others. Some may be faster and some may be slower. And I know from experience that in almost every field, there are writers who really aren't meant to be writers, doctors who aren't meant to be doctors, cops who shouldn't be cops, and baseball men and women in the front office, who probably should have chosen a different line of work. What I mean by that, and I don't leave myself out of this because I can't judge me, is that there are people who, maybe as kids, maybe as adults, find that they love the idea of a given profession. They love baseball so much that they need to be part of it. And they are good enough to do that, to accomplish that, to be part of it. They can do it passingly well. They can do it at a C- level, but they're not necessarily good at it. I know that sounds really judgmental. I don't mean it to be. I feel certain, though, that all of you in each of your individual lines of work, whatever they might be, public-facing or private, have some colleague who's good enough not to be fired, but in some sense isn't really good enough to be there. What keeps ringing through my head as I say this is a line from a movie I really love, a movie that I find to be rather underrated. Dan Hedaya in the Tom Hanks movie Joe versus the Volcano, Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. If you've seen it, you understand what I mean. For the first, 10 minutes of the movie, you eavesdrop on Dan Hedaya making a phone call as part of his job in this terrible, almost vampiric office. And what he says over and over again is, I know he can get the job, but can he do the job? That distinction is actually what I'm referring to here. But who knows where you are on that scale between getting the job and doing the job? That's why I say I can't leave myself out of it. I have written thousands and thousands of words for public consumption. But I know, just by virtue of being, one, very self-critical, but also honest with myself, and being as much an avid reader as I am an indefatigable writer, that there are a lot of writers who are way better than me, and also some who are, technically at least, much worse than I am, or don't develop ideas as well. In some cases, they've had much bigger careers, but that's a sort of a different subject. My point is that everyone on that continuity gets to call themselves a writer, just like everyone with an MD gets to call themselves a doctor. And for that matter, we can go through the baseball encyclopedia from Henry Aaron to Paul Zuvella, and every single person, including them and between them, gets to call themselves a major league ball player, even though there are vast qualitative differences between them. Within that definition, major league ball player, there are strata, just like there are strata in the ocean. Epipelagic zone, mesopelagic zone, bathypelagic zone, abyssopelagic zone. In one sense, it's all seawater, but each layer has different qualities and produces a different environment. Now, I don't know which layer I belong in, and maybe you have a better sense of which layer is yours. You know what's really scary? You don't know which layer your heart surgeon belongs in. The best you can do is read the online reviews, which aren't very helpful because they're all about how his front office staff is terrible. Kept me waiting for hours and wouldn't let me reschedule in less than 6 weeks. Said he was stuck in surgery. Yeah, yours in an alternate reality. You want him to rush? Imagine if you said to the receptionist at the surgeon's office, look, I can't wait. And he or she said, I'm so sorry, Mr. Gimlet. Sometimes he's just too thorough. I'll tell him to hurry it up, okay? Hey, doc, chop, chop. And he came in, wiping blood off his hands, all stained and everything, and said, I'm really sorry, Bob. I didn't want to keep you waiting, so I just replaced one of the chambers of his heart with a tomato can. It'll keep until after we're done here. I hate waiting at the doctor's office as much as anyone else, and I do more of it than some. But I still don't know what people want because, like all of us, I find myself complaining if I wait half an hour to see a guy, and then he gives me a cursory look and I'm in and out in 5 minutes. I feel ripped off and like he didn't really examine me. Conversely, when I have a really good doctor who spends 30 minutes with me listening to my life story and checking my every organ and orifice, I realize that means someone else is waiting for 45 minutes as I waited for 45 minutes, and you can't have it both ways. Team builders in baseball, roster builders, the people who assemble the team we watch, by which I mean primarily general managers, who actually are the tip of a pyramid for a much wider or vaster chain of human beings, but for better or worse, they get both the kudos and the brickbats. They're like the ocean. There are strata. They can get the job, but not all of them can do the job. at the same high level. Look at what we know of all the general managers, going back to the dawn of front offices. I realize my saying that there are only so many general managers in the Hall of Fame out of the total population of general managers is a poor proxy for depicting that range of outcomes and abilities, but it's also handy, so let's try it. As far as I can tell, maybe I missed someone, there are 7 from the American or National Leagues. They are Ed Barrow of the Yankees, Pat Gillick of the Blue Jays, and so on, Larry MacPhail, Lee MacPhail, Branch Rickey, John Sherholtz, and George Weiss. There are a few others like Connie Mack, Bill Veeck, who kind of double up as owner, general managers, or all 3, manager, general manager, owner in Mack's case. But it's really those 7 who are in there for building rosters, making trades, constructing farm systems, arguing salaries, and so on. And of course, for Branch Rickey, there's one other very special thing. That's 7 out of the complete population of heads of front offices. That doesn't mean that there aren't a dozen more who could arguably be in, but it gives you a sense of the weakness of the field. There have been a lot more great baseball players than there have been great executives. Could more jump in? Sure. I thought of 2 without trying very hard. John Quinn, who built the 1948, 1957, and 1958 Braves. That's 3 World Series appearances and 1 win. And then rebuilt the Phillies in the 60s, although that run didn't pay off. He was the GM of the 1964 team that flamed out so spectacularly in September. I find it interesting, too, how complicated baseball is, in that you could be the general manager who brought Henry Aaron to the majors, but also be the general manager who mishandled Dick Allen. My other suggestion, this one's pretty easy, might be Harry Dalton, who built the great Orioles teams that won the World Series in 1966 and 1970, and also put together the Brewers team that culminated in the 1982 American League pennant. And you might be able to think of several more where they came from. And by the by, both are very dead, and therefore their having plaques is utterly irrelevant to anything. It's too late, you bastards. But the museum is incomplete without them. What museum is complete? In what universe is it possible for a museum to be complete? Sorry about that. I don't know where that came from. I was making a point that there have been a few good general managers and a lot more who weren't necessarily bad, but didn't succeed either. I qualify them that way because our information is incomplete. Maybe they might have been great, but their owner held them back. More broadly, again, there are degrees of competence even within groups of broadly competent people, just as there are subsections of water in the ocean, even though all of it can be described as water. So it's not that your team's general manager is stupid, generally speaking, and only wants to sign players with 295 on-base percentages, even if it does kind of work out that way sometimes. He didn't get there because he doesn't know that that's a bad idea, allowing for very rare exceptions in which the owner puts his son-in-law in charge of the team or brokering peace in the Middle East or some other damn thing that he's not qualified to do. On the whole, your team's general manager would like to, all things being equal, build a team of good players capable of winning 90 to 100 games. That might have been a little different when I was starting out, because back then, not every general manager spent much time thinking about, well, on-base percentage, but that's all in the past now. They didn't even all accept the validity of it, and it wasn't exactly a new concept. You've all heard the talk radio host do that rant, the one where the host says, "How could the Texas Rangers be so stupid as to trade for a terrible player like Moses Jury? It's Aaron Judge, not Moses Jury." That is great for the host to do. Outrage gets you listeners. I would argue that today, 99.9 times out of 100, the front office does know the difference between judge and jury. There are just reasons that they can't act on that, including the fact that there is only one judge, but a whole lot of juries. And beyond those calls, those easy, obvious calls, the rest is borderline. It would be borderline for Brian Cashman and borderline for Branch Rickey and borderline for every general manager you could name where you could acquire the player, and it might go one way, it might go the other. I remember a front office friend, as they used to refer to them on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, telling me about a player he went out on a limb to push his boss, the general manager, to acquire. And they did. And the player didn't strike me as anyone special. He was the kind of player who, if you caught him on the right night, looked like he could take you to a pennant. The problem was that he was not consistent at that level. And maybe your front office friend says, I know how we can rejigger his swing and get him to that level every single day, or at least 5 out of 10. Or maybe we can teach him a new pitch, get him to emphasize the spin on his curveball, and he can go from the back of the bullpen to closing. Maybe your front office friend is right, and maybe they're wrong, and maybe the player really has the potential within them to unlock those things, and maybe they don't, but you don't know until you try. And if it works out, then the sports talk radio host goes on his show the next afternoon and says, what a great move it was to acquire Modith Jury. What great insight to see that his swing could be rebuilt. And if it doesn't work out, then again, we're back to stupid. It's like having an abusive parent. But the thing is that outside of everyone named Judge on your roster, which is at best one player, that kind of dichotomy applies to everyone else, or at least, let's say, 22 of the 26. You think the Mets anticipated Juan Soto hitting .238 in June? I know he's been better lately, but he sure hasn't been Juan Soto. And Soto is one of those guys I would put in that Judge no-brainer category. Actually, here's a true story. Years ago, I was having a conversation with the general manager off the record, and I remarked that a certain player, a Hall of Fame level player that he had recently acquired, I said I was surprised that he had been so inconsistent. And what I got back, you would never get this if, say, the general manager did a spot on Mike Farron's Sirius XM radio show. You would never get that. They would be much more diplomatic. I got a long stream of curse words because that general manager was bitter. This was supposed to be a slam dunk, and he should have been sitting there basking in the glory of having signed him. But no, life is just like that. It's more complicated than simple binaries like smart or stupid. You can have a good process and get to a bad answer, and vice versa, though in the long run, a good process will lead you to the right answer far more often than a bad process will provide you with a good one. It can happen, though, because, again, randomness. Now, I often apply this same form of thinking to politics, in which one side seems so hapless, so feckless, so immune to doing the obvious, and it's tempting to think like a sports talk radio host and say, why are they so stupid? And then I remember my baseball experience, and I figure they're probably not. Then I wonder, if they aren't, why aren't they making moves as obvious as signing Aaron Judge when they have a lot more Judge-like options in front of them? And then the answer comes back, well, either they don't want to, or, like some of our general manager friends, the owner doesn't want them to. And that is where I start to spiral. I start to spin downward into realities which seem too true to be conspiracy theories. All hope vanishes, and I land here in the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 334. I am Stephen Goldman, your semi-convivial host. I've had a rough day, but no, I can't be less than convivial if you are here. If you are giving me your time, then I want you to have the best of my time. Now, I realize I say this every week, but what I might be, as opposed to unconvivial, is that a word? Hostile, I suppose, would be the opposite of convivial. I might be concise, and our second act of the show might go a little bit faster than the normal one. That really wasn't my intention, though. It's not so much that I'm pressed for time as sometimes a story just doesn't need as much space to breathe. Like a desert-dwelling rodent, it is happiest in a small and enclosed space. As you know, as I have said often here, a story should be the length it needs to be told. And we can't always do that, particularly those of us who write online. because people who run websites are very aware that people tend to click away from long-form writing. Why that strikes them as a new idea, I'm not sure, because if you've ever had the experience of, say, taking one issue of Action Comics and one copy of War and Peace and placing them next to each other on a table, you will understand rapidly that one will be easier to dispose of than the other. One requires the commitment of 15 minutes, the other requires the commitment potentially of years of your life. I will confess that I have attempted War and Peace. I have not gotten very far. Now, conversely, I recently read Dune for the first time. I'm very proud of myself because as a teenager, as even a preteen, an adolescent, whatever you want to call that stage of life, I was very into science fiction, and I bought a copy of Dune at that time for $3.50. And in the long centuries since then, I have carried that copy from place to place, thinking, well, maybe I'll finally I got mad at it at that time because the fact that you had to turn to a glossary every 3 lines really irritated me, made me very impatient at that young age, and so I put it aside, probably for more issues of Action Comics, which, to be frank, weren't very good at that time. Then, more recently, I saw the movies. I didn't love the movies, but I was intrigued enough by the politics of the thing, there's that word again, to attempt the book one more time. This time, I stuck with it, 500 pages, including the appendix and the glossary, and I'm still not sure that I liked it. I think I liked it. I definitely didn't love it. It's very stilted in a lot of ways, structured oddly, but I'm happy anyway. You know why? Because I made that $3.50 stand up. I alternated chapters of that with Richard Evans' new book, or newish book, about Hitler's People, which is an attempt to answer that musical question that wiser minds than Nazis have been asking going back to the 1930s, which is who actually goes for that kind of stuff. Who turns Nazi? Which I think Dorothy Thompson might have been the first one to write about. We've talked about Dorothy Thompson a bit on the show. It seems spectacularly relevant to our time, but I find myself, as I read it, dragging baseball back into it, almost as an inoculation against what I'm reading, and it makes me feel good. And let me give you an example of what I mean. I was reading the chapter on Adolf's second-in-command and head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering. And the chapter begins, Hermann was born in 1893. And I think, oh, John McGraw started at shortstop for the Baltimore Orioles that year. I think, oh, he was 3 years younger than an American of German heritage, Casey Stengel, initial nickname Dutch. Goering graduated from a Prussian military institute in 1913, and I think, that was Casey's rookie year with the Brooklyn Dodgers. He hit about .275. During the war, Reichsmarshal Goering looted great quantities of art from across Europe, and I think in 1956, Casey took the Yankees to Japan and bought a kimono he liked to wear around the house. And what do these things have to do with each other? I think that last one kind of gave it away, which is simply, here are 2 more or less contemporary figures. One of them lived to 1975, and the other might have gone on that long as well had he not chomped on a cyanide capsule the night before the Allies planned to hang him for crimes against humanity. And that's the difference. One was a benevolent figure. Sure, some players loved him, some liked him, some loathed him, but he was more or less a benign person in this world and deserves to be remembered as a benign person. The other was a murderous, venal, genocidal embarrassment to the human race. And he was supposed to be one of the more savvy guys among that crew, which just goes to show you that when you let an ideology control your thinking rather than the world around you or being receptive to the information that it provides you, it makes you dumb. Kind of like a general manager in the old days who refused to accept the validity of on-base percentage and insisted on signing players who were fast because you need a speedy guy at the top of the batting order. I can't say that had there been baseball in post-First World War Germany, the horrors of the 1930s and 1940s inflicted by the Nazis could have been avoided. I mean, we've got it here and now, and it's not exactly helping things. But I do think that National Socialism might have had a slightly harder time gaining a foothold, and certainly some of the rootless young fellers who ended up swinging billy clubs at helpless minorities might have better channeled their energies swinging bats at baseballs. We're overdue for a break, so very quickly let me tell you that we are starting up a mailbag at Baseball Prospectus. I'm calling it Baseball Prospectus, please, although you could just read it as Baseball Prospectus, please. I'm riffing on the old Information Please radio program, which I love so much and wish there were more than 3 seasons of it preserved. You don't have to be a subscriber to write into mailbag at baseballprospectus.com, and I or any of my BP colleagues can respond. It doesn't even have to be a question that's strictly on the topic of baseball. We all like to talk about a lot of different things. You could ask me more about Herman Gehrig, though I don't imagine why you would want to do that. Why ruin your own day the way that I tend to do? But as you know, one of my great privileges in this job that I have is to get to interact with you, whether by talking with you on this program or writing columns that you might happen to read. But more than that, I relish the opportunity to learn from you, to hear what you think about some of the issues that either we cover on the site or that I talk about here, or that are happening to us in the world at large. Because as I began this program by saying, well, you know what I'm going to say. I've said it so many times, you can say it with me there at home or in your car. All together now, kids too. Baseball is everything, and everything is baseball. And yeah, I wrote a column about that too this week and how I'd like it to be otherwise sometimes. But we'll leave that aside for now. Check it out if you like. Let's go to a break, and on the other side, we're going to visit a player who tried to drink his way off the Cleveland Indians at the turn of the 1940s, but that wasn't really the problem.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Ranked #1 in innovation for 10 consecutive years and #2 among public universities for employability, ASU isn't just ahead of the curve, it's creating new paths to success. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online, that's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, you know, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Before we turn our attention to the West and to Cleveland, unless of course you're listening to this sitting in California, in which case I'm jealous, but turn your attention to the East, I wanted to mention one of the challenges of telling stories on this show. I almost took a bit of a risk today. I was looking at telling you about a pitcher who was described as dull as dishwater, tough guy to interview. He had nothing to say, and I attempted to convince myself, almost as a challenge, that I could make him interesting enough for you to listen to 15 or 20 minutes about his story, even if his quotes were limited to yep and nope. Now, you might say that's a fool's errand, but you wouldn't say Lou Gehrig wasn't interesting, right? Now, just the other day, I stumbled across a video on YouTube. Someone had uploaded some cleaned up, colorized sound footage, newsreel footage, I assume, of the Yankees during the 1931 spring training session. This was the year after the Rabbit Ball, and the American League was trying a new one, a theoretically toned down one. And offense did come down quite a bit over the year before, although it was still pretty robust compared to, well, now, with the average American League team hitting .288 and scoring about 5.5 runs a game. The Yankees scored over 1,000, and they didn't even win the pennant. So this must have been late March or early April, and what that revised ball would do was still a question to be determined. This must have been March or April, and the video fades in on Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth flanking manager Joe McCarthy, and they're just kind of awkwardly posing and looking like they're hoping it will be over soon. And someone, one of the writers I figure, shouts out, "Babe, what do you think of the new ball?" And he, not looking terribly thrilled, says, "Well, we haven't really played in good weather yet. There's been a lot of wind blowing in, so it's hard to tell what the ball is really doing. When we get to better weather, we'll have a stronger idea of it." And then, as if realizing he had nothing else that he cared to say, he turned to his right and said, "I imagine Lou feels about the same way. Lou?" And Lou says, "Yep." Then for some reason, the whole thing resets, and the writer asks something like, "Okay, babe, but what do you really think of the new ball?" And Ruth says, "Well, it's like I said, we haven't really played in good weather yet. We'll know better when we do. How about you, Joe?" And McCarthy says, "I haven't really noticed anything. How about you, Lou?" And Lou says, "Nope." So you can see what we're up against here in the baseball storytelling business. And yet, you want to hear about a real jerk? About 3 years ago, back in episode 226, I talked about catcher Rollie Hemsley, who was one of baseball's most open, acknowledged alcoholics in the decade of the 1930s. He had a long career despite that, playing in nearly 1,600 games, and that includes missing a year due to the Second World War. Yet he did bounce around a lot because he was hard to handle, given just how often he wasn't in shape to play. Despite that, he got to play until he was 40. He wasn't a bad guy. He just had an illness, and although he didn't hit much, he was a good handler of pitchers. And as I mentioned in that earlier episode, drinking tended to make him playful, not angry, although what I'm going to talk about here is a possible exception. Another story I told at one point was about the dead ball era catcher Larry McClain, still one of the tallest catchers to have a decent-sized career. He drank, got rageful, tried to brain John McCraw with a lead pipe, was eventually shot dead in a bar. Hemsley wasn't like that at all. But still, it was a problem. And to his credit, and to the credit of the Cleveland Indians of that time, they kept him instead of just shuffling him on and tried to help him. He was with them from 1938 through 1941, and as I described in that earlier episode, they had an honest-to-goodness intervention, got him to Alcoholics Anonymous, and although that program doesn't work for everyone, it really worked for him. He bought into it and was sober, as far as I know, from then on. I'm not saying he never had an off day, because quitting addiction, quitting substance abuse, is among the hardest things a person can do. But for the rest of his life, he proselytized for the program, and there's a tradition of that sort of thing in baseball, where players who had problems, players like Ryan Duran, Don Newcomb, Sam McDowell, I guess it's not all pitchers, but those are the first ones that come to mind, they tried to help out players who were still suffering and trying to get free. Now, that was in the future, in February of 1938, when Cleveland general manager Cy Slapnicka traded 3 players to the St. Louis Browns in return for Hemsley. "Rollie is a playboy," said the Cleveland press, which I suppose meant that men pretended to read him for the articles. No, that was just the euphemistic way that they spoke about players who didn't keep good hours and tended to, well, do what Rollie did, which was drink the bars dry. But young Bob Feller liked throwing to him, so the team was prepared to overlook his tendency to be a merry wanderer of the night, as Shakespeare might have put it. The previous season, he had been fined $5,000 by the Browns, managed by Rogers Hornsby and Jim Bottomley for about half a season each. According to Baseball Reference, his salary might have been all of $7,500, so he came pretty close to owing them money. Now, Cleveland's new manager was former Major League third baseman Ossie Vitt. After a playing career with the Tigers and Red Sox, he went off to the minors and managed in the Pacific Coast League and the International League, notably running the loaded 1937 Newark Bears club for the Yankees. Now, recently here on the program, I've made a couple of references to the so-called Crybaby Indians of 1940. They were called that because a good number of them thought Vitt was hypercritical and they didn't want to play for him anymore. And after making that complaint privately to Cy Slapnicka, they fell out of the pennant race and everybody said that they had whined their way out of it. During the 1938 spring training session, which Cleveland held in New Orleans, there were plenty of rumors going around that the Browns wanted to get rid of Hemsley and that Cleveland would very much like to acquire him to go with the catcher they already had, Frankie Pitlack, more about whom in a moment. Cleveland did not deny those rumors. Vitt, asked if they were true, said he would really like it if they were. If the Cleveland Indians obtain Raleigh Hemsley, he said, I'll keep him in condition if I have to go out drinking with him myself. Can you imagine a 1980s manager saying of one of his players, if that coke-sniffing son of a bitch keeps hitting 2 homers a game, I'll buy the next vial myself. Ha ha ha. Well, they did get him. Cleveland acquired Hemsley on February 10th. Vitt said, I didn't ask Hemsley to take the pledge, but I did ask that he conduct himself so as to deliver his best brand of catching, both for his own sake and the club's. I am sure that Hemsley means to behave, and I'm going to help him by announcing an automatic fine of $500 on any individual on the club caught drinking with him, because I have heard that his coming may be regarded as the signal for some of the fellas to get off the reservation. Disciplining his companions may be the answer that will kill off temptation. Not a month went by before Vitt had to send Hemsley home for, quote, breaking training, which meant drinking, and his program of fining players who drank with Hemsley kind of backfired, because yes, one of the reasons that he drank was because he felt good being in people's company and he needed the lubrication, or vice versa. I'm not sure of the order of operations there, but the fines also meant that the other players wouldn't socialize with him, so he was lonely, so he drank to kill the loneliness. Thus, having already used up 2 strikes and promising Vitt that I won't take a drink until October, he used up the 3rd strike. It went something like this. He went out drinking in New Orleans with, quote, some old friends from St. Louis. He came back to the team hotel towards midnight, sporting a black eye. It was his bad timing that a newspaper photographer happened to be hanging around the lobby at that time, saw him stumbling in, and decided that a picture of him in that disheveled state would be just the thing for his paper. Hemsley saw what he was doing, realized it was a threat to him, and chased him away, or so he thought. The photographer thought he'd take another run at it. He followed Hemsley to his room, waited a few minutes, and then knocked on the door, thinking that when Hemsley answered, he would snap a picture and be gone. Well, he knocked, but he didn't get the shot. Hemsley answered, grabbed him, dragged him into the room, and then brained him with a bureau drawer full of his best shirts. Well, there was hell to pay. I'm not sure what kind of shape the photographer was in. Hemsley was not arrested for murder as far as I know, but Vitt did send him away. You're not wanted around here until you're ready to conduct yourself in a responsible manner, Vitt told Hemsley, and off he went back to Missouri, terrified at having to confront his wife and kid. Cleveland owner Alva Bradley said, Raleigh was contrite, very contrite, and he did eventually come back. He split time with Pitlack, who to that point of his career was a much better hitter than Hemsley. Relatively powerless, he hit all of 7 homers in his career, but through his first 500 games in the majors, he hit .301. Hemsley, too, had one of his better offensive years. There weren't many of them. He hit .296, .367, .409 in 66 games, and for a while, all was forgiven. Too much forgiven. And what I mean by that is that later in the season, after a rousing victory over the front-running Yankees, Vitt, really full of himself, said, we shellacked them today, didn't we? That was as good as a quart of tonic. I feel like asking Raleigh Hemsley where he goes in this town when he wants to celebrate. And that's what you call a jerk. Someone who wants to have it both ways. Hemsley went 3 for 4 with 3 RBIs off of red roughing in that game. But you know who isn't on your side? You know who isn't your friend? The guy who says, I really care about you, please straighten up and fly right. But the moment you do something that pleases them, they say, give me 2 of what he's having, and 2 more for him as well. Vitt lasted 2 more years, and then his major league managerial career was over. Deservedly so. Allow me to mention again that I'd love to hear from you at mailbag@baseballprospectus.com. You don't even have to be a subscriber. All it takes is a keyboard and an idea, and that's how babies are made. You can also follow me on social at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can write us, by which I mean me. Here's a second email address, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And for one more week, I swear, there's a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning, bang, you're there. Should you wish to support a program that likes to dine on prime rib, please visit patreon.com/The Infinite Inning. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, try reading Dune, but only if you spend no more than $3.50. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, is called The Infinite Man, and it's called that for a reason, and it was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, strange roads have strange cars, so if you see one, maybe it's time to pick a different highway. Well, speaking of highways, if I can just make out what that signpost up ahead says, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside The Infinite Inning.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.